Our Little Secret, the true story of a teenage killer and the silence of a small New England town, by Kevin Flynn and Rebecca Lavoie. Narrated by Avon Shore. Prologue. Danny Paquette's killer walked into the visitor's room at the New Hampshire State Prison for Men. He was cheerful, even pleased, to see a new face, someone who hadn't known him before he was arrested. The killer claimed to be a popular man. To get someone new in to see him, the killer had to drop someone else from his visitors list. It was his old dentist, he said, and prison rules said she couldn't be added back to the list for at least 1 year. "I'm the only one in here with a waiting list of people wanting to get in to see me," he said. At first, he did not want to talk about the details of that day, instead hoping to drop the story altogether. "Please don't reopen old wounds," he said. But on the other hand, he did understand why so many people were still interested in the story. There were many questions still left unanswered. Who else was involved? What convinced him to do it? How did he go 20 years without being caught? The only question that didn't need to be asked was, why? "I've had plenty of people, very prominent people, say to me they would have done the same thing," he said. The killer claimed that he still got letters every day that called him a hero. That's because everyone knew he killed a child molester. It took 20 years to solve the case of who shot Danny Paquette in his own backyard. Not 20 years of complete mystery, for the police seemed to be perpetually close to cracking the case open, but 20 years of silence. Though some regarded his killing as a senseless murder, many more weren't the least bit sorry that Danny Paquette was dead. Only one person's finger pulled the trigger, but dozens of others pressed their fingers to pursed lips in silence. That perfectly aimed bullet ruined many other lives in addition to the one it ended that day. But as the years passed and the silence grew, many people judged the crime righteous and justified. Many knew. No one spoke. Their reasons varied, but the act of frontier justice was all made easier to bear because of one thing. Danny Paquette had it coming. Part 1. The Murder of Danny Paquette. There are 4 kinds of homicide: felonious, excusable, justifiable, and praiseworthy. Ambrose Bierce, The Devil's Dictionary. 1. On a November morning in New Hampshire. On November 9th, 1985, the morning that Danny Paquette was murdered, he had planned a full day's worth of work. It was a Saturday, but nonetheless, Danny liked to stay busy. He had a strong work ethic, something he probably learned from his father. The old man had run the Paquette family dairy farm in the 1960s, getting up early in the morning to milk the cows before heading off to put in 8 to 10 hours as a construction foreman. Danny's latest girlfriend, Ruth Celeste, was new to New Hampshire, having come to the Granite State from western Pennsylvania with her ex-husband and 3 teenage sons 6 months earlier. Like a lot of women in town, she'd found Danny Paquette extremely attractive. She'd liked his rugged looks and his bad boy demeanor, though her boys hadn't shared her admiration. In fact, the boys and their mother's new man had recently had a falling out, which had been brewing for weeks over inane stuff such as the fact that Danny wanted the kids to get their rusty car off his property, and they resented the way he said it. At the heart of the matter, Ruth's boys were sure that Danny was just using their mother. In turn, Danny had no patience with the boys, whom he considered lazy. Danny Paquette was 36 years old when he died. Ruth had warmed his bed the night before. Her sons had spent the night back at her place. Danny had a voracious sexual appetite, so she made sure to please him. Even though she hadn't known him long, she'd already learned that the only side you'd ever want to be on was Danny Paquette's good side. Richard Duarte got up around 7 o'clock on the morning of November 9th and ate breakfast. He wanted to get an early start that Saturday. His plans were to get over to Danny Paquette's place and work on the car he was keeping in Danny's garage. He'd bought the 1954 Ford from Danny, who was also letting him use his tools to work on it. The men were friends who'd bonded over cars, and Duarte had already spent the previous evening at Danny's, monkeying with the Ford until 10:30 p.m. After getting dressed, Duarte drove to the local parts dealer before driving back to Danny's place, on Whitehall Road in Hooksett, New Hampshire, a small town on the north side of Manchester, the state's largest city. Danny's property had lots of land, a house, a nice barn, and a decent-sized garage. It was perfect for Danny's real job. He was a welder by trade, and a damn good one. Auto repair was just a hobby. As Duarte pulled up Danny's driveway at 9 a.m., he passed the welded metal sculptures that his friend had fabricated out of leftover parts from his steady stream of jobs. Unlike other men in the welding trade, Danny wasn't afraid to also consider himself an artist. Duarte found Danny Paquette with Ruth Celeste in the garage. They were laughing about something. "You're awful," Ruth scolded Danny, who slapped her on the ass as she made her way out. "I'll leave you to do your work." Danny got one last long look at Ruth walking away before speaking to Duarte. Finally, he took a deep breath and said, "I've been waiting for that kid who helps me out to give me a call." He rubbed his hands on a rag. "Okay, let's get to work." There was no doubt Danny was in a good mood. Danny told his friend about some people he expected to come over that morning. "You have got to meet these two Canadian guys," Danny said to Duarte, who had his head under the hood. "They chew cigars and speak broken English. It's a freaking riot." "When are they coming?" "This morning. I made a fuel tank for them." As if on cue, Duarte heard a truck pull up and a pair of doors swing open and close. He saw the Canadians come up and shake hands with Danny, but Duarte kept his attention on his troublesome Ford. The Canadians, Gabby Caron and Eugene Blouin, had met Danny only a week earlier. Blouin's brother-in-law, Gil Daigle, had been one of Danny Paquette's neighbors for 7 years, and it was Daigle who'd recommended Danny's services to Blouin and Caron. Just as Danny described, the men spoke with the thick French-Canadian accents common to Quebec and not unfamiliar to New Hampshireites. Canadians had been traveling south to work in Manchester's textile mills for the past 125 years. "Danny," Caron asked, pronouncing the name Danny. "Can you do the thing to the tank?" The men had earlier talked about getting a toolbox welded on top of a fuel tank that they'd bought from Danny. Danny laughed and led the men out of the garage and around the corner. He had his welding equipment set up next to a bulldozer. Blouin noted the bulldozer, which he called a bulldozer, and asked if it belonged to Gil Daigle, his brother-in-law. "Yep, I'm going to do some more work on it this morning," Danny said. Danny fired up the torch, welded a 2-inch piece of pipe onto the tank, installed a leather pipe, and then welded a strap over the pump. Danny's speed impressed the Canadians. It took him only about 6 or 7 minutes to complete the task. The guys joked around some more. Blouin showed Danny how to balance 10 nails on the head of one, a trick that really impressed the welder. "Hey, is there a party going on here I wasn't invited to?" Gil Daigle ribbed as he walked up Danny's driveway and saluted the other men. He had come over to borrow a caulking gun for a home project. Caron looked at his wristwatch and realized that he and Blouin had to leave for an 11 a.m. appointment they had at the Chevrolet dealership. Duarte yelled for a missing part, and Danny told him to look in the trunk of one of the other cars nearby. "Can I give you a hand with that?" Daigle helped Blouin lift the fuel tank onto the back of his 1977 Chevy pickup before following Danny around the corner to look at his bulldozer. "What do you think, Danny?" "I should have it ready for you today," he said. "I'm still waiting on this kid from work to show up to help me paint some of the tanks." Just then, 17-year-old Court Burton walked up the driveway, waving nervously. The kid stood around as Danny accepted a check for $244 from the Canadians, then went scrounging for the caulking gun Daigle needed. Daigle walked home to put it to use while he waited for Danny to finish working on the bulldozer. The Canadians pulled out of the driveway and aimed their truck toward Manchester for their appointment. Driving down Whitehall Road, they passed a series of hunters who had just pulled to the side of the road and disappeared into the woods, toting rifles on their backs. Court Burton had met Danny Paquette while working construction. Danny had a steady job welding for a utility company, but he also made plenty of money on the side as a freelance, or gypsy, welder, working by the hour at construction sites. Danny took an interest in Burton, and even though he was more than